This is an interview of Thomas N. Hanrahan. He was born April 25th, 1922 in Los Angeles. I'm speaking with Tom at his house in Vancouver, Washington. I'm Tom's son. My name is Thomas E. Hanrahan, and I'm honored and privileged to be conducting this interview as part of the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. So, Dad, can you tell me about your experience in World War II? Where did you serve?
Well, in World War II, I was a student in Los Angeles when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And when they bombed Pearl Harbor, that made everybody think that we should do something to try to protect our country. And so I tried to enlist in the service immediately the day after Pearl Harbor. But there's such long lines of people doing the same thing that you just could never actually get any attention. You couldn't enlist because it was just too busy. It seemed like everybody in Los Angeles wanted to sign up.
Where were you when you heard the news about Pearl Harbor?
Well, actually, I was driving back from Idlewild, California, and went up to my mother's cabin, and on the way back, we heard about it. And of course, it was a time when there was a big draft because of the war in Europe, and they were drafting people from age 21 to 37. And being 19, I was not in the draft, but I decided that I was actually enrolled at the Loyola University in pre-engineering, and I dropped out to enlist. And on January 23rd, 1942, I was inducted into the service at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, California.
Did your friends also enlist?
One friend of mine enlisted at the same time. My friend Branford Pierce Jr. was his name. And he was, I think, a year younger than I was, so he was 18 and I was 19. And so we were inducted together, and from Fort MacArthur, that was for just the induction and getting our basic shots, and we were then put on a train and taken to Shepherdfield, Texas, which was for boot camp. And Shepherdfield, Texas was just a great big, huge red prairie which the wind blew across one side back and forth every day, and red dust covered everything. And it was in the wintertime, in January and February, it was very cold, and it was not a very good introduction into being in the service.
You enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Why did you do that?
Well, the one thing was I was interested in airplanes and the possibility of maybe being able to fly. But once you become an enlisted man in the service, you're then at the discretion of the service itself, and you do what they tell you to do. You don't just do it. And I actually applied for Air Cadets, but they moved me so quick, like everything else in my life, that the application that I sent in, they sent back for preparing for exams and all, but it never caught up with me until I was overseas, which was too late. Mm-hmm. I never pursued it beyond that, but it would have been, I had a very good friend who was in the service with me that early on when we were in the California area that did apply for gunnery school, and he went to gunnery school, and he became a ball turret gunner in B-17s, in which I met him again in Cambridge, England.
What was his name?
Bill Vance. He was a lovely man. So, but anyhow, that's pretty well where the start was. And,
at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, you just did paperwork, got shots?
But yeah, and you can't believe what they do to you there, because well, you get in the line, and it's time to get shots. All right? So you walk along your line, you start to go through a door, and as you get to the door, someone grabs you from each side, and you get a needle's poked in both arms.
Yeah.
And this is back when I forgot what the shot was, but one that really hurt. I forgot the name. Yeah, I was wondering what your arm got, just like this. So it was quite again, 19 years old, never been away from home before, and all of a sudden this is happening to you. It's just quite eventful.
You lived at home at the time?
Yeah, I lived at home at the time.
Who was there with you?
Well, I lived with my mother and my sisters. It was a family home, and I'm still, it's in a sense, growing up, you know. So,
And when you shipped out to, let's see, what was Shepherd Field, did they come and take you to the train station? Were they
oh
at the
no,
train
that's
station? with you?
right there. Once you're in the service, they transport you there, and they're in the 2.5-ton trucks in the back of the truck. You have benches along the side, and you just
So you sat in a truck all the way to Texas?
no until you get to the station where you get the troop train. I
Oh,
was
I
on a
see.
troop train, and troop trains then were well, again, it was a very difficult life for a young guy. You get on the troop train and you find that as an enlisted man, all officers are different. The enlisted man, they had if you remember how the old trains were, they had the double seats with the kind of table in between, you know, and we'd put 3 soldiers to each of those seats. And then at night, those seats folded down became a bed, and you had a bed up above. Well, at night, 2 slept in the down and 1 slept above. So these people don't even know. All of a sudden, you're with 2 strangers, and night comes along, and so you sleep. If you're lucky enough, you get the one up above by yourself. Otherwise, you have a bed partner, which you didn't know before.
How did you say goodbye to your family?
Well, you don't. No. Well, you do just by sending them a message. You know.
Well, at some
You didn't
point,
have cell phones and things
Yeah.
those days, so
Yeah.
no. I mean, you're in the service, and you don't have any freedom. You have no rights. You're on duty seven days a week, 24 hours a day. And,
so once you enlisted, you didn't see them again?
well, there's other parts of the story, but you have to listen. Because after Shepherd Field, Texas, I went to Denver, Colorado, to Laurie Field, Colorado, where I took training in aircraft armament, so to learn how to repair and install 50 caliber machine guns, cannons, and anything else that's an armament. And when I finished at Laurie Field, which was for a period of a couple of months, in April, enlisted in January, went to Fort MacArthur, Shepherd Field, Texas, in April to Denver, Colorado, and in June, 2 months later, I was sent back to California, where I was stationed at the Naval Air at San Diego, California. And our base there, again, I was assigned to the 82nd Fighter Squadron, in which we had P-38 airplanes, and my job then was, of course, to work on the armament. But also, this was now near Los Angeles, so I could, on the weekends, get passes, and I could go home. So I did get to go home and visit my family while I'm in San Diego. And at that time, whatever friends I made, I also took to San Diego with me. And so there was a period when I got to visit my family, but a very short period, because even though I got there in June, and by the time October came along, we were then going to be sent overseas, the whole group, the whole squadron. And so we were sent to Marchfield in Riverside, California, to start to get ready. And after about a month there, we got sent to Camp Kilmer in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And that was to prepare to do the next step, which would be to get on the Queen Elizabeth and sail to England, because that's where our squadron was going. Again, the whole squadron was going. And,
At what point did the squadron form? When did you start seeing the people you were going to be with?
Well, actually, the first 10 months I was in the service, in fact, the whole time I was in the service, it was really the first 10 months in which I was at Fort MacArthur, Shepherd Field, Laurie Field, Naval Air Station in San Diego, Marchfield, Riverside, Camp Kilman, New Jersey, and Queen Elizabeth and England. That's all in 10 months. So now you try to figure out what I did each place with, it's almost impossible. Because you're just moving all the time and learning new things. And you made friends, but you also, everybody moved and shifted, so you didn't really keep the same friendships for very long, because People went off different ways and did different things. So,
Did you get to see your mother and sisters before you went to the East Coast?
well, not after we broke up San Diego and went to Marshfield, no longer. No,
Okay.
not seeing them again. I did not see them again until the end of the war. It was a long time. Yeah.
They wrote letters to you?
Pardon?
They wrote letters to you?
You could write letters. But writing letters again was something different because when you're overseas in a combat area, you can't just write letters and mail them. They had some kind of a sheet that folded, in which you were allowed to write on that inside, and then it went through censors. So everything you wrote was censored, and anything that you wrote that seemed to indicate where you were, what you were doing, was blacked out. But you didn't see because whoever it was censoring your data. So what my family saw was never necessarily what I wrote, because it was what I wrote, but also it was anything I said in there that was suggested was erased. So, yeah. So that's how you mailed. But I could get received mail, and they received mail.
So as we were talking, you took the troop train over to the East Coast. Where were you on the East Coast?
Well, wait a minute. Let's go back to the troop train.
Okay.
The troop train is a very slow vehicle that goes across the United States from San Diego from Marshfield, California, Riverside, to Camp Kilmer, New Brunswick, New Jersey. And it doesn't run like a passenger train. It goes along very slow. It gets off on sidings, and you sit. To eat, you have a car that has where the food is, and you go up with your get it on a platter, and you have to stand in line to get to eat. You only do it a couple of times a day. You have to walk to all the cars to get a freight car that has where the cook is doing the cooking and where the food is, which is a little bit difficult. But then the train got to Chicago, and I always never got to Chicago because there it sat for a couple of days before it could move on again. So it took quite a few days for the train to go across the United States. And then, of course, it also, in the old trains, you didn't have air conditioning. You went with the windows down. You had the smoke and the cinders and the dirt coming in, and most people caught colds or something because it was very unpleasant. But it was all for a purpose, and so it went by. But it's hard to remember back with much pleasure as having a sightseeing trip because you're not sightseeing.
What were you doing on the train while it was moving?
You were sitting and looking out the window. You couldn't. You had thousands of people on these long trains. It's full of service people, and every train was full. So somehow you did it. I don't really remember. It's been so long ago. But I didn't know we got to Camp Kilmer. I know it was only there a few weeks while we were getting whatever necessary shots and things were before they could take us by bus into whatever they did to get us to where the Queen Elizabeth was docked, and we got on the Queen Elizabeth, which was a brand new ship that had only been put into, taken over by the military or not taken over, but was used by the military to move people overseas. This before it was ever used as a passenger ship. So, and inside with the beautiful ship, with all the proper paneling and the stairways and all the decks and all the beautiful staterooms that had never been used. But the problem with the ship is it was 1,000 feet long, and I forgot how many decks, but lots of decks. And on board you had about 3,000 or 4,000 people who operated the ships. They were all British, and then you put another 15,000 troops on board. And so you now got some 15,000 to 17,000 people on a ship that was designed for a few hundred passengers. And then again, there was a separation between the officers and the enlistment. There always is, because the officers get the elite type treatment, and the servicemen are piled together. So they take staterooms that were designed, for a pair, maybe a double, one large bed and a bathroom, and whatever space there is. And for inside that stateroom, they had 7 triple-decker beds. These are not very wide beds, but there was, and not very far between the different layers, but there was 7 triple decker beds, and 21 people, men, moved into these rooms with their barracks bags. And your barracks bags are big bags full of all your clothes and all your belongings. So, and then the only water that ran into the bathroom part there, of course, was the seawater, which was salt water, and the only water available was salt water, except for your canteens. And then twice a day you got in line to where they were putting out the fresh water. You filled your canteen full of water, so you had your canteen full of water that you just got thirsty. They served meals twice a day, so you spent most of the day just standing in line. And because with that many thousands of people on board to eat, you had to stand in line. And generally the standing line meant that you went from one deck to another, so your line actually wound up stairways. And so by the time you got there and ate your meal and got back down again, it was almost time to get back in the back of the line again. So
Stop for a second.
this only
There's
lasted
not enough storage.
6 days and 6 nights is what it took to arrive in the Perfect Clyde, which was off the coast of Scotland, for which we then got on kind of open, what do you call it? Open, decks, open deck type things that floated in and out, and they took us ashore, and then we got on troop trains, and the troop trains then took us overnight to Cox Hill, England, where there was an old English air base that was going to be our home. And this English air base, again, was something very unusual because we had not our airplanes yet. We were just people just getting here. You're just trying to bring a whole squadron of people in and trying to organize a squadron. And they had Quonset huts, which were these galvanized huts that and on the inside, of course, in this area, had no insulation at all, so it was just a thin galvanized covering. And then inside you had one little round stove, which was about, I guess maybe no more than a foot in diameter and about 3 feet tall, which you burned coal in, and that was supposed to heat up this whole unit that had probably 20 or more beds in it. So it was rather cold. And it's in the wintertime in England, it's very cold. Then the most interesting of all was the latrine. The latrine, they had a tent that was put up. Now there's snow on the ground and there's ice around, but this tent was a great big tent, which the sides were rolled up about 2 feet, so there was open all the way around the sides. And within it, they had set buckets. The buckets were, maybe 30 inches tall by a diameter of 18 inches, in which they put a wood seat on top, and these are where you did urinate or the things you need to do. But the buckets, of course, were always full and overflowing, so it was rather, you went out into especially if you'd been in bed at night and needed to go out to the bathroom, you went out through the snow and you walk in to take one look at this, and it was very difficult.
Yeah. One question before you tell me about the camp. On the trip across on the Queen Elizabeth, was there ships escorting you?
No, the Queen Elizabeth went all by itself because they went too fast, and it had, I guess, early radar because it was, all of a sudden the ship would turn and go off in a different direction and it would turn again, and so they were very careful because they were fast enough that they outran the German submarines. The German submarines were sitting waiting for it because that had been the biggest plummet the submarine captain could have had, was be, of course, shooting down the Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Mary to blow it up. So we would, in the daytime, we spent most of our time, as I said, just taking care of whatever toilets we had to, and then standing in line to eat. And we would had open decks, and you could go out in the open decks, and you could look out and watch the ocean, and you could see what's going on. But at nighttime, then you had to cover up all the open decks had to be covered because you had to have all the lights out. You had to be so the ship could not be seen. So at night times, it was there was no open decks to go out to. Yeah. and every day, at least once a day, there was a boat drill. And that was, again, a drill where you were put on your life jackets and you went to a certain location, which you were supposed to, because it would happen to be that you did get torpedoed and had to evacuate. They were always ready for that, because every day you had a boat drill. And that was to set up so that there was some system in case the ship was torpedoed. And the amazing thing is during the whole war, the Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary went back and forth and never got torpedoed. And those who went in convoys, they were shooting ducks for the Germans, and many of those ships were torpedoed because it was easy for the submarines to find them. So you really were safer being in the ships that went without convoy than the ones who were in convoys. So the convoys were something I never had to do. But also I had the good fortune then when I returned home from, almost 3 years later, I came home in the Queen Mary, so I managed to go across the ocean once with the Queen Elizabeth and come back on the Queen Mary, which is pretty fantastic just in itself. Two very famous ships.
Good. You said you arrived in England on December 1st, 1942, and that you were transported to Cox Hill, and you described some of the conditions there. Tell me about the food you ate.
Actually, you have to realize that this is was the 78th Fighter Group, in which there were 3 fighter squadrons, and each squadron is made up of about 300 men. It's not just me, it's about 300 men. And so the entire group, though, is probably more like 1,500 people. And within that group, what you're trying to do is you're trying to set up an organization where you can put fighter planes up in the air to go and protect bombers and to do other missions that are set up for them. And so when you arrive at a place, if you're usually brought together with your own squadron, which is you have some 300 people, most of which you don't know because they are all set up in the different things. The squadron isn't just people, but it's ordnance, it's warehouses, it's cooks, it's the people who work on airplanes. It takes a whole bunch of people to make something, one thing happen. And each group each squadron at that time, we were probably servicing something like 15 planes and maybe had 15 or 20 pilots. But of course we arrived there before the planes, so the planes still had to come. And so then we first had to find a place, they set you up in some kind of a living quarters and living condition. And you just proceed to do what you're supposed to do, and that is to start to put the business together so that it will operate. So when your airplanes come, they have a place to park. You take care of those airplanes. And new over here meant that the pilots had to take training and learn where they were and how to fly in the English or the European type problems with the war. And so this is what we did. In the meantime, you had to live in a place that was extremely cold, and live in good housing conditions that were rather testing. And like I said, with your bathrooms being open tents on top of buckets that didn't flush. And it was interesting that to drain those buckets, anyone who misbehaved, and so they were put into the guardhouse, they also became the ones who had to go around in the back of a truck with great big huge containers, and would have to get off and pick up these smaller containers full of all kinds of urine and the like, and pick them up and dump them in the bigger ones on the truck. And that was it. So you really didn't want to get in trouble and have to end up in that. What happened to that? That was rather shocking.
Did you ever end up there?
Did you ever end up in latrine duty?
No, I did not.
Good
Thank
for you.
heavens. Although, in the Air Force, on a squadron, because everything is technicians or the like, that you have very few privates, and most of the time in the Army, the privates are the KP and the guard duty and things like this. But they're in a group, you might have 300 people, in which you probably have less than 10% are probably privates, because there's just new guys that haven't moved up yet. You used to get some kind of a rank just for position. And when I enlisted in the Army, I was a private. After 3 months, I was a PFC, and by the time I got overseas, I was a corporal. And then I actually got promoted to sergeant, because I guess I did my job well enough. And but I still had to do KP when it was called for. I still had to do guard duty. And so did even the ones above me, like staff sergeants, they still had to do it, because you don't have enough people to provide those jobs if you just use the privates. So. But it didn't happen too often. And then in Cox Hill, which was interesting, instead of having, you didn't want to have airplanes set up in a line on any kind of runway, because the Germans could come over and strafe them. But this way, our planes were put out into the area around the airport. So it was often in areas full of trees and things, so that your plane was really isolated. And after, not too long after we arrived, and our airplanes started to arrive, the Germans started to bomb right across the river from Cox Hill at a place called Hull. They had shipping yards, and the Humber River had separated us from Hull, and they would bomb right across the river. And at that time, the first time, of course, we had never been through this before. It was rather a shock to all of a sudden see all the searchlights go on and the anti-aircraft go, and you could see the guns sparkling up in the sky. And so we ran to get into the we tried to, run out to our airplanes, and we were told that we had to take our guns and go to the airplanes in case any of the Germans should parachute down and decide to come and try to steal an airplane, which I never thought would be possible, but we still had to do that. So we grab our guns and go out to the airplanes and do guard duty for a considerable length of time, because once the Germans decided to turn around and go back, if anybody had parachuted, they could still be around wandering through the woods somewhere. So it was quite an introduction to the war front, because we just moved from the United States and all of a sudden we're there.
What was your life like when the P-38 airplanes and the pilots did arrive and they were operational?
Well, what interesting was they arrived and they were taking their first training flights to get ready to do a combat mission. But all of a sudden there was some kind of a problem in Africa. And whatever the problem in Africa was, we heard all kinds of different rumors, like maybe the Germans had strafed an airfield and shot up all the planes, but they required and needed our airplanes and our pilots. So our pilots got into our airplanes and flew to Africa. So now we have neither pilots nor aircraft. And in the meantime, we found out that in Ireland, across the REC at Belfast, Ireland, Lockheed had a plant there in which they were bringing P-38s over and putting them together to P-30 airplanes. So they took 20 of us from Cox Hill and sent us over to this Lockheed plant in Belfast, Ireland, so that when the P-38s came out of the Lockheed, we could take them and put our 50 caliber machine guns and our cannons in them and get them four-sided and set up so that they were combat operated. And then a group of pilots would fly those down to Africa, and they would take a C-47 and fly back to Belfast for the next set. And so we spent about 2 months there just taking airplanes and getting the armament on them, and also making sure that they were mechanically ready.
Was the preparation different for planes flying in Africa than planes flying in England?
Well, when they come out of the factory, they're not set up for doing operation. There's airplanes, and so your machine guns have to be four-sided so that they will shoot in the direction and shoot where you want them to be. You have to have gun sights inside the airplanes that work, and these things have to all be. So when the pilot gets in, all he does is start pulling triggers. And you do this all the time with your planes, because you do maintenance and all. So it's a matter of that the plane, when it arrived in Africa, it was ready for a combat mission. It didn't have to be, have people go through and set it up.
How did you test the guns?
Setting the guns it was a really interesting thing, but it didn't last very long. But with the P-38 was a tricycle landing gear. You could pull the nose wheel off, and then the plane would tilt forward. And so there was a river or a lake right beside us, and I don't exactly remember the name of the lake. But we would roll the airplane down to the edge of the lake, take the nose wheel off so the nose would drop down, and we'd get inside the airplane, and we would actually shoot the machine guns. And see that they were operational, and then also ports went to where they were supposed to go. And we did this, for several days until one day, someone was out there on the lake with their boat, and they shot a red flare up in the sky, and it became obvious then that what we were doing was dangerous, and there was a stop put to it, so we no longer could test our guns by shooting them out across the lake. We weren't even shooting across the lake, we were shooting into it, but still they went way out into the lake with the bullets to go in there. And 50 caliber machine guns had pretty good sized bullets. And the cannons were 20 millimeter cannons, so they were pretty good cannons.
Our family ancestry is Irish. Did you get to go and see other parts of Ireland while you were there?
Just in Belfast, because we were in the English side of Ireland. We went down across into the Irish part itself, and of course we would be interned because that was how do
Ireland was a neutral country.
You'd be interned because it was a neutral country, and so if I wanted to escape, I guess I could have gone to Ireland and been interned there for the rest of the war.
But you would have been considered a deserter if you'd done that.
Oh, sure, I've been a deserter. So I didn't do that. But I enjoyed Belfast. At night we could go in. So this was just sort of like working at a job, we worked in the daytime. At nights we were free, so we'd go into Belfast and do what soldiers do.
Did you have to stay in barracks there?
Well, the interesting was when we first got there, the 20 of us, we were part of Lockheed, and they had housing for the Lockheed people, and we were actually allowed, assigned to it, and we started to eat in their mess. But then the local U.S. Air Force commander, who had an air base nearby, found out, and they decided that wasn't really fair because the other soldiers didn't get the same treatment. So then we had to be part of the general's airfield and use his barracks and the like. So we had fun for a while.
What did you do after your 2-month stay in Ireland?
Well, we went back to Cox Hill, and we found when we got back to Cox Hill that we had new pilots who had been sent there, and we were going to change airplanes. No longer had the P-38, but we were now going to have the P-47 Thunderbolt. And of course, the P-47 Thunderbolt was new to all of us, and so we had to go back into training again. The pilots had to learn to fly them. We had to learn how to maintain them, and so we proceeded to. So this was what? This was December, January, February.
Of
So I
1943?
guess about March then. So we had for the next month. I guess we started to learn how to live with P-47s, and then all of a sudden, a month later in April, they transferred the whole bunch of us again down to an air base near Cambridge, England, which was an old established English air base that had actually buildings and hangars, and it was really very classy.
What was the name of this place?
And it was Duxford Aerodrome. And Duxford is still a very famous place right now. It's a very famous museum for the World War II aircraft.
You were telling me that as the P-47 Thunderbolts and the new pilots came, that your operation was transferred to Duxford Aerodrome near Cambridge, England. Did this have a nickname? You mentioned me before.
I didn't hear that.
Did the Duxford have a nickname?
Just Duxford, I don't think it had anything else. It might have had some some significance if it was online, I think, but I don't know. Oh, yeah. Duxford was so fancy compared to other bases, and then we had lots of American bases all over England, and they were most of the ones with the Quonset huts and the like. This one here had buildings, and we had bathrooms, and we had all the luxury of being in a resort. So it was called the Country Club of the ETO, which was the European Theater Operation.
So you led the country club life,
We had
huh?
the country club life, and in a sense we did, yeah, when it comes to that. We
Um,
had big hangars, there was the whole thing.
What about the food? Was it country club food?
No, the food was always the English rations, because in Lend-Lease, we traded things with England, I guess, and it was just the English food and rations were already over there. That was the part that the English provided for us, and so we had English rations. Of course, we had
What kind of food was
the
it?
dehydrated potatoes, and we had Brussels sprouts and Brussels sprouts was an interesting thing, because if you were assigned to KP, the chances were you were put into a room with sacks of Brussels sprouts, and you sat there and had to trim off the end of the Brussels sprout. And after you go through a gunny sack or two full of Brussels sprouts, you never wanted to see another Brussels sprout. But
What-
Brussels sprouts was a lot of the meal.
What kind of meat did you have?
I don't remember too much about the meat, because they were very good. It was either the English type lamb or something, or it was ground up stuff. It was never very good meat. Meat I don't remember meat that's ever been anything very pleasurable.
Mutton and lamb.
Sometimes in liver, they would put out liver and things that I never liked was impossible. But eating in the military was not very, very fancy.
When the planes started flying and the pilots were on their missions, what was your life like then?
Well, it was a very busy life, because I meant that we were actually finally organized and finally could put planes into combat, and that's what we were there for. And as I say, by the time we got to this point, I had been in the military now for 1 year, and down in Duxford, I had my 21st birthday, so I'm now 21 years old. And the B-47s, which had 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, and under each wing and underneath the belly of the plane, there were a place where you could connect bombs, or you connect auxiliary gas tanks. And so on any mission that the plane was going to go on, they had to decide on how far it was going, and whether they had, because an airplane has to have fuel, and when you send it someplace, you want to make sure it can come back, so it has to have enough fuel to go a certain number of miles, and has to have enough fuel to be able to do a certain amount of flying to combat the enemy at that time, and still have enough fuel to come back. And it was very risky, because it was usually just enough. And if the planes couldn't come all the way back, they either had to parachute and dump them somewhere, or they ended up in the English Channel, and you lost your plane. So the big thing then was always to know what the mission was, and then set the plane up for that mission. And when we first started, well, what first happened was in the early part of 1943, the bombers, the B-17 bombers, started to go over and bomb certain areas in Europe. And because we thought, because of all the armament on a B-17 had 10 people on it. They had machine guns that were gunners on the sides of the plane. They had in the tail of the plane. They had the ball turret underneath the plane. They had a turret up on top, and they had a turret up in the nose. So they figured, well, we have enough firepower, we can fight off the enemy. But they found out that wasn't true. The first groups of B-17s that went over all got shot down, and you lost 10 guys in every plane that went down. And so it got to where you had to question whether this was smart or not. The English started to do this when the war first got going. They started sending planes over in the daytime, and they were all shot down. So the English said, no more, we won't do it in the daytime. We will do nighttime bombing. So they went to nighttime bombing. We came over with our B-17s, all the armament, and thought, well, we will do daytime bombing because we have our armament. Then we found out, well, that's not so good either. So we needed the fighter planes to go along and protect the bombers. Something to fight the German planes rather than let the German planes just shoot down the bombers. So that's how we got involved. And so then it took us a while, though, to have our planes and our pilots now ready to go ahead and protect the bombers. So the bombers had a few months there which they did not have our protection. But then once we started, then it made things a little bit better. But the first start is the bombers went a lot farther into Germany than our fighter planes could go. So we could only protect them part way. And so that's when you started to use the wing tanks and the other kind of auxiliary gas so that they'd fly so far to drop the tank and so they could fly farther and still be able to come back. But that still was not far enough because the P-47 could not fly as far as Berlin and come back. So then after, let's see, I guess in 1944, the next year, we actually changed the P-47 and got P-51s, which was a plane that was much more capable of going distance, and these planes could fly all the way to Berlin and do their bit and still fly back. And that's when, as a fighter group, we did our best part of helping the war effort. Our planes also were capable of carrying bombs, so there were times that we had these bombing missions themselves, so they would go to bomb a train or a shipyard or something. And so our planes did do some bombing. Towards the end of the war, what they did was strafing, and because the Germans were being had enough of the war now that their pilots and their planes were being shot down, so they were losing their experienced pilots and had to put up less experienced ones, and they were losing their aircraft to the American aircraft and to the English aircraft. So they we didn't always find them in the air, so our planes then would go down and strafe the airplanes on the ground. And we were starting to shoot up the airplanes, the German airplanes on the ground, so they had no airplanes to put in the air, which was what the intent. And so we did, in the last few months of the war, most of our, I think our missions was to strafe airfields, and that's what they did.
For a mission, you'd get up in the morning, what would you have to do on the day of a mission?
Well, it depended on what the mission was, but we always had to have the plane ready for the pilot to get in and take off. So it had to be started up, pre-flighted, fueled, the tanks had to be fueled, the guns had to be all activated. You have to get them ready so they can be fired. So all you have to do is pull the trigger. So
What'd you do while the pilot was away?
Well, the pilot's away. You always had some things to do, but you had to take care of some things. But the rest of the time, you waited for your plane to come back. And the missions were sometimes several hours long. And the big thing was, so when they came back, then of course you had to be ready to. If you shot the guns and did things, you had to be, or if he was shot up. Sometimes our planes come back with holes in them. They were shot at too. They didn't go over there and not get shot at. So when they come back, you took whatever you had to do it to make that plane ready for the next day. So.
What if a gun had misfired or something during the operation?
Well, it's a misfire. Those things happen, and it depends upon how bad the misfires were. Sometimes all the guns would block, and they would not fire at all. I was not very happy. But the machine guns, like everything else, there were things that were moving parts, and if the moving parts have some kind of a defect or something happens, then they won't work. And so when the planes come back, they immediately you checked your guns and see if they all shot and fired properly. And of course, this was whether you did your job well or not. And we found that we had to learn things, of course. And the first thing you learn is that if you clean the guns and you oil them to keep things from getting rusty and working, but if you have too much oil on, when they got up at high altitude, they froze. The oil froze, then the guns wouldn't work. So if you did something like too much oil on, they froze, and then you had these all these 50 caliber bullets that were in clips, and as the clips were drawn into the barrel of the gun, if they were a little out of line on the clips, then of course that would block, and they would not go into the gun, and then that blocked the gun, and it would not fire. So you had to be very careful that your armament was your 50 caliber clips would flow properly and go into your gun. You had to be very careful your gun didn't freeze, and then if you had everything else adjusted right, then they were right, and but they could still break like anything, the car thing. So, for most of the time, the guns worked pretty well. And when the pilot fired the gun in bursts, he was firing 8 50 caliber machine guns, and they were.
Did you have pilots who took down enemy aircraft?
Well, of course, I forgot what it was now, but our organization had credit for some 600 my 78th Fighter Group had, I think, got some 600 aircraft, German aircraft. About half those were probably straight from the ground, the other were shot down. And they, some of our pilots were happened to be at the right place at the right time, and they would become aces by having shot down at least 5 German aircraft. Many of them would go back and forth and maybe fire a gun, but never really see aircraft. But it depends on lots of different things, and so many of them got shot down just by the German ground fire, which was shooting anti-aircraft guns up into the air. And
Did you ever have a pilot not come back?
and I had pilots that didn't come back. I had lots of different pilots fly the planes I was on, but then usually you get a pilot assigned to your plane, and if he happened to be assigned to it long enough to go through all his missions, because he had to do a lot more than the fighter plane, than the bombers did. I forgot exactly what he did, but he got lots of hours doing it. So I had 3 pilots, especially that I had for long periods of time. And the first one was named by Hockery. It was John Hockery. What was his name? I think it was Hockery. And he had shot down 7 German planes, so he was an ace. And he also had done some strafing. And he got that towards the end of his scheme. He got shot down. He was actually a prisoner of war, so I lost him that way. But he managed to survive being a prisoner of war, and he ended up staying in the service after the war. And I understood he went to Korea, and he even shot down some Russian MiGs in Korea. And then I understood he passed away, and he was about 65 years old, so he's been gone for a long time. And after that, I got a young guy who was Robert Bosworth, and he was really a hot young man. And these were young kids. These guys were like 19, 20 years old. These are not old. And he didn't have the opportunity to shoot down too many, but he shot down a couple of planes, and he shot down. Or I remember one time he shot up a truck on a bridge, where he shot up railroad trains as he go by, and he did the strafing, and he managed to go all his time and come back to the United States. And then the last one I had was a guy by the name of Croy, and this was on P-51s, and he was really a nice gentleman. It was Milford Croy. He was from Seattle, Washington. And at almost one of the last missions in the war, which is kind of sad, he was strafing an airfield, and strafing the airfield was much more dangerous than flying and fighting the aircraft above, because all the German anti-aircraft guns were shooting at you, and you're coming down over the airfield. All these guns are shooting at you. So we lost lots of planes just by being shot down by the ground, by the anti-aircraft. And he got hit. His plane got hit, and I understood his plane got hit, and he pulled up to like about 1,200 feet and parachuted out, but he was too low until he got killed, which was sad.
What did you do when his plane didn't come back?
Pardon?
What did you do when you knew his plane didn't come back and he died?
Well, you waited till you got assigned to another airplane. I was just.
Did you have a service for him?
Oh no, heavens no! You just know those things happen. Oh no, not in wartime. Yeah. Maybe afterwards somebody might have done things, but not during the war. They were sad, but you had another mission the next day. Just like overnight in Afghanistan, those places a day, somebody gets blown up and killed. That doesn't change the body comes back. Maybe somebody will have it up over there. Wars are not very nice things, and wars are started by governments, and wars are directed by middle-aged or over-aged generals and the like, but the wars are actually fought by teenagers, by kids, by 20-year-olds.
During the war, did you have any social life? Were you able to do anything away from the base?
Oh, we had some. It was, having been in, at Duxford, it was just about 7 or 8 miles from Cambridge. We were there from April 1943 till September 1945, I was. And during that period of time, we could get passes at night when we were not operational. We got 6-hour passes to go to Cambridge, England. And it was a nice town, and they had taverns and places you went to, or you could go to Red Cross or like places, or you could go to dance halls, and you did a little bit of all, you know, you went on your things, and you get to meet some of the local people, and which I was very fortunate to do, and I had a gentleman there who was actually the bartender in the American Bar in Cambridge, and I was invited to his home, or his wife and child, and actually was able to get a 7-day leave one time, and I went and spent 7 days with them. And at those kind of times, you could actually take food from the base with you, so you could help provide food for them. And this little girl, which I don't quite remember exactly how old she was, but she was 4 or 5 years old or so. And I rode home, and my mother would actually send some clothes over for her, so I had dresses and things that I was able to give to her. And so it was, it was fun to meet the English people, because they'd already been to the war, for a few years, and they had been bombed and have been threatened in all kinds of parts of the war. And there are the English soldiers, the ones who had gone off to Africa and other places to fight. They went off, and they'd been gone 6, 7, 8 years. It's a long time before they got to come back home. And so all of a sudden in England, you had not only people like me there in the Air Corps, but you had all these soldiers that were being brought there ready to make the invasion. They all started in England. All of a sudden, you got millions of American soldiers roaming around in England. So you go to an English city, you saw more American soldiers walking down the streets than you saw English people.
Did you
That would be hard on the English.
Yeah. Did you ever get to London?
Oh, I got to London several times, because you could get, once in a while, get a 48-hour pass, and it wasn't too far to London. You could go, and again, they had American Red Cross where you could stay. And you could, what you did was like you do other places, you walk around and see everything. So I walked around and saw whatever there was to see. Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace, and the time just went by, you do say. And of course, when you're in London, of course, you were also subjected to bombing. So the Germans were still bombing it. So everything was blackout at night. So you had certain ways of living, but it was interesting. Because all through the war, until the war ended, the Germans were doing something to try to irritate or try to stop the British. First, they came over with their own bombers and dropped, and then when that was no longer suitable, they started to send over the buzz bombs, which are like the drones we have today, and be loaded with bombs, and this aimed towards someplace in England, and they would fly until they ran out of fuel, and they would drop down and blow up. And then they started to do this V1 bomb, which was the one that like a rocket bomb that they would somewhere along the coast of Holland, because actually we could see the vapor trails going up in the sky when one would be shot off. Even though it was a long ways away, and you could see the vapor trails, and you knew that one went up in the air, and it would go way up in the air someplace, and then it would finally start to come down, and wherever it came down, it would blow up. So when it hit London or wherever it went, they weren't that accurate, but the buzz bomb was the interesting one, because you could hear it. You could hear the buzz bomb, because it would go put, 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 and you'd be out there working, and you kind of stop, and you hear put, 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 put. Then the put would go away, and that was fine. And you go put, 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 and all of a sudden it was quiet. And you held your breath. And someplace you went, pop.
You mentioned to me at another time that the British and the Americans were also worried about chemical warfare from the Germans.
Yeah, for some reason, after the invasion is when things got uptight. When they decided they were going to have the invasion, first of all, everything got very tight and secret, and tried to, we were supposed to surprise the Germans. It was very difficult to make this kind of a movement and not have, some way of having them forewarned, because it was really bad. And I thought, well, the Germans may retaliate, and different ways they retaliate. One is to send our planes over real quick and try to shoot, whatever, where our boats and things were taken off to head for France. And so that's when some of us were sent down to a field real close to the coast with our planes, and we sat waiting just for alerts. Our pilots sat there with all their equipment on, and we were waiting for all of a sudden to have an alert come in saying the planes are coming, so we could take off. It never happened. And I thought, well, it could be possible that the Germans might retaliate by dropping chemicals, gas and things on it. So I was sent down to an English air base, or not an English, but an English army base near Salisbury in England to take a course in chemical warfare. And I don't know why I was picked either, but all of a sudden I was on an English train all by myself and go down to this air base, and for 2 weeks we were taught about chemical warfare. We were actually put in little containers where we would drop different types of chemicals, where we'd take our masks off just long enough just to get the whiff and get some sense of it. And then so I was supposed to go back to the group base, and then if there was chemical warfare, I guess I was supposed to do something. But nothing ever happened. So I don't know what the value of it was, because I went back and I had a certificate saying I did this. And the Germans never dropped the chemical gas, so I never had to show that I knew anything. So,
Tell me what your D-Day experience was.
well, I didn't, we didn't really know what D-Day was. We knew that all of a sudden, a few days before it happened, that everything was shut down tight. You couldn't get in or out of the base, and so everything was just froze, and so you knew that something was up. And then, of course, when the invasion started, then our planes had to also go. So all of a sudden, our airplanes had to go, because they were, trying to help protect the ships that were doing the invasion. But this is, they only like 20 miles or so across the channel there. Everything's very close to you.
It's the weather.
Yeah.
Did you have to relocate?
Yeah. No, we didn't relocate.
You didn't go to Dover?
Oh, what I already told you about that. That's when, after the invasion started, we took a few of us down there just to be on alert, to protect against some retaliation by the Germans. But what we were actually doing was to sending our planes over to help protect the ones who were doing the invasion. And then that meant that the planes kept coming back and forth, coming in, going back as best they could. But then you're always involved with the weather there. And there was one period of time, I think it seemed like it was around the invasion, it might have been before, where we had a really hard freezing frost. There was icicles, and everything was white gray. The sky was white gray. You couldn't take a plane off. You couldn't do anything. And it was cold. And it was cold. Until so that kind of stalled us for a while. But under most conditions, we were able to fly. But you still, you had to be able to. You couldn't really fly and protect somebody. You couldn't see anything. So bad weather, you really didn't fly much. The bombers could, I guess, and drop things, but not the fighter planes. They would see what they're doing. But there's a big difference between, what you're doing. You got 300 guys on the ground to have 20 airplanes up in the air with 20 pilots, and the pilot is the one who has the skill and is doing the job that we're sent there to do, and he's the one that's got the courage and know-how. And maybe it gets shot down, maybe it won't. But there's for every pilot up there, there's 100 guys behind are responsible for them being there. So it's difficult to separate out who the real heroes are, because it's really interesting wartime. They'll pick somebody and say, "Oh, this guy's a hero. He did all this," but nobody does anything by themselves. And it's also having to be in a certain time in a certain place, but they do that because they have to, make it sound like Well, I feel sorry for all these people like that. The war going on now is so different than the war I was in that I can't believe that we're even doing what we do now. We send these young kids over to walk around in these cities where they get bombed in cars, they get bombed walking down the street, they get shot at, and they really have no front. They're not really fighting a war. They're there to support something, but it's really weird.
What was the end of the war like?
Well, all of a sudden the war ended, and they called it VE Day, and everybody was happy. And I guess all the people in England were happy. I remember some people went down to London and got in crowds and waved their arms and jumped up and down. And to me, it was just, the war was over in Europe, but it was not over in Japan. So we were still doing the same job, and we were told, okay, now we're going to get ready to move to the Pacific. We weren't going to come back home. We were going to go to the Pacific. And so we were preparing that. Things did change, and I guess, you no longer were sending the airplanes and the pilots up, so that changed. But as a group, you still had you had all your facilities and things. They had to be put together. And whatever the government was deciding in Washington or someplace as to what they were going to do with people, where would they be, where we'd go to the Pacific, where it would be. And then this was, in the springtime, like May, and then a few months later, or late fall, and then all of a sudden there was DDay Day, and the Japanese quit, so then now we no longer have to go to Japan. So then that's all of a sudden they started, we'll send people home and you'll get discharged. Well, you had to have a certain number of points that depended upon how many years of service and how many years overseas. And you had to have a certain number of points to be sent home, and I had enough points. It's 100 or so. And so when my turn came, I was sent to, I don't remember, someplace to just get ready to take the ship home. And what I was put on was the Queen Mary. So all of a sudden I got put on the Queen Mary in September of 1945, and we headed back for New York. And the Queen Mary was interesting because it was probably about as big a ship as Queen Elizabeth, not quite as big. But we had so many troops on board that they couldn't bed them all down. So you had I think it was the two upper decks where one night you'd sleep inside and one group would sleep outside, the next night you would alternate. So it was really loaded with people. And it took, I think, 5 days for it to come back across the ocean to New York. And in New York, and then from New York, we went back to Camp Kilmer again brought back to being citizens of the United States again. And then after about a week or so in Camp Kilmer, I was a group of us, whatever it was, went to Newark, New Jersey, to the airport, and there they had C-47s, which were DC-3s. And in the inside of a C-47, you had a row of seats going down each side, which were just with little indents where you would sit, and you sit with your back to the window facing the aisle in front. And of course you had your barracks bag and all your clothes with you, so whatever it took to fill up that plane, and we started to fly back to Los Angeles from Newark, New Jersey. The plane took off, and the next thing we knew, we landed in Washington, D.C. It went a long ways. Then we took off from Washington, D.C., and they don't go very far, and we ended up in someplace in Tennessee, I think. We landed there. And then we took off from there, and we landed in someplace in Texas. And it took 21 hours to fly from Newark, New Jersey to Los Angeles.
Tell me about when you arrived back in LA after the war.
Well, when we arrived back in Los Angeles, they made it off the airplane. We were back to Fort MacArthur again in San Pedro. And you have a few days there of having to go through the things you have to go through to get separated from the service. And at that time, my sister and mother could drive down to visit me, so I got to see them. And one of the first things, of course, they did, anybody who did their job reasonably well, I guess, and had some rank, they came to you and said, if you'd like to re-enlist, well, you can move up a rank. And I said, no, thank you. And then after it took about 2 weeks, and I was out, so my family picked me up, and back to my family home. Because you have nothing when you come back out of the service. You're just, you haven't done anything in the last period of time to set up for civilian life. You make nothing. So,
When you first enlisted and you were a private, what was your pay?
well, the first 3 months was $21 a month, and that was not really quite that much because I signed up for the GI insurance, which took $6.50 a month out of my 21. And in those days, they had recreational rooms, in which they charged you $1.50 a month or something for that. So after a month, you would stand in line to get your money.
What was your pay at the end? What was your rank at the end?
It was sergeant, and again, depending where you were, overseas you got the bonuses. So the pay in actually the pay in England wasn't bad as a sergeant because I was getting something like $80 a month, which was more money than the guy who was English guy who was running a train engineer. Because that was $80 a month was not bad. But then when I come back, I got discharged, so it's no longer part of it. But, when I first got back, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I don't think they had all the GI bills and things set up yet. These things were just, God, that looks familiar. Boy,
This is your jacket. This is your army jacket.
yeah, it is, isn't it?
So tell me what all of these things mean.
Well, what happens was, this means every 3 years, you get one of these. This is your 3-year enlistment. So after 3 years, you get one. So that means I was in over 3 years, because I had 3 years. Each one of these is 6 months in a combat area. And of course, that's a buck sergeant, 8th Air Force.
There's a medal here. Is that?
Oh, that's just the Air Force stuff, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah. And this is called the what do they call it? This you put on to show that you've been discharged and you're no longer in the service, but you can still wear your uniform if you don't have any other clothes. Yeah. The ruptured duck, they call that the ruptured duck. Yeah. Yeah.
And this?
And this shows that I was an armorer, cannon, I mean a bomb.
You know, it looks like this would still fit you.
And inside they have should have my social security, my army number, Hanrahan 19078284. Now this is interesting, 19078284, as I remember it,
Yeah.
the 1 means I was enlisted. If I had been drafted, that would have been different. The 1 is enlisted. The 9 is the 9th Corps area, which was in California, that part, 9th Corps area. And I was the 78,284th person to enlist in that Corps area. Yeah, so that's how the number came out. And it's still my army serial number. Let's see if it fits.
Yeah.
I was this.
Can you stand up?
Those jackets actually were big long things, and you had them cut to make them look neat. So. They did, no, they didn't come like that. So you'll see a lot of people wearing them.
Some styling.
Oh, no pipe. No pipe. Oh,
Well, turn around. I think it actually fits you pretty well.
yeah. I think I was 155 pounds or something.
Show Sonia.
My arms haven't got any shorter.
Did you have other medals?
I remember growing up that he had a bunch of service medals.
Yeah, I had some there.
I think I might have a bag of them.
They had it was a good conduct one, I know. And I think over here we had one that was the unit citation. We had a couple of unit citations. And then we had one that was the European Theater of Operations. And some of them, they just gave you little oak leaf clusters to put on. So each time that you had some, those different battle things I was in, I also got some kind of a cluster for them.
How old are you now?
Well, it depends how you look at it, but I'm really 91 years and 7 months old. And I will shortly be 92.
Do you have contact with other men that you knew during the war?
Well, I did have contacted one who's been my friend from ended up being in the bombers group, my friend Bill Vance, who came back at the end of the war after we were all discharged. He actually lived in Iowa, but he came out to Los Angeles to visit me. And we had a visit in, I guess it was 1946. And then he went back to Iowa, and he went to school, and he became a dentist. So he ended up being a dentist. And I first went to work in my uncle's gas station for 6 months while I was waiting to decide what to do. And then I took the GI Bill, and I went back to college. I spent 2 years at Loyola University to get a pre-engineering degree, and then from there I went to St. Louis University and got a degree in exploration geophysics. And so the GI Bill was a very nice thing, and it served a lot of American soldiers very well. It was one of the best things the government could have done was the GI Bill. Much better than unemployment insurance and that kind of stuff. If you don't get anything from it. But the GI Bill was the thing that made the 50s and the 60s such a great world, because we all of a sudden all these people got educated. And that's pretty well rated as some of the greatest time in our country is the 50s and 60s. And I think the GI Bill had lots to do with that.
Well, thanks, Dad.
But in the meantime, since then, I have a beautiful family of 6 children, 5 sons who are terrific. And I'm pleased that they have not had to go to war.
Good. Thanks, Dad.